This session is, I've kind of titled it Powershell Scripting and Toolmaking Traps. I have been teaching and writing about PowerShell since the Monad days, since it was first released. So I have taught a lot of people and seen how they interact and learn PowerShell. And so these are some of the things that I have seen over the years that trip people up or have the potential to make you bang your head or increase your bourbon consumption or something that's like, oh, this PowerShell, why? This is so hard. It's really not hard. You just have to understand a few things about PowerShell and how it works. So I'm assuming that everyone in here has some sort of PowerShell experience. Is that a fair assumption? Anyone completely new to PowerShell and has no idea what I'm even talking about? All right. And that'd be fine. That'd be fine. But we're going to assume that you know some things about PowerShell. I'm going to assume that you have written a PowerShell script or a function, but maybe you've struggled a little bit in getting those things to work. All the material that I'm going to go through today is up in a GitHub repo, which you're welcome to download or clone. So let's talk about a few scripting things. So some things, when you're writing a PowerShell script, it can hurt you. If you're not careful, you go, oh, why is this working the way I'm expecting it to? Well, it's because sometimes some of these little gotchas are things that you think you should be able to do, but you really shouldn't do, and I'll kind of explain why. So here's the number one, with a bullet, scope. How many of you, as you were learning PowerShell and writing scripts, were burned by scope? Or even have understand what I'm talking about? So this is the number one trap for beginner PowerShell scripters and toolmakers. So what you have to understand, and we'll do a little teaching here on this. So for those of you who are maybe still haven't quite gotten into PowerShell scripting or understand all of this, anytime you do something in PowerShell, whether you're running a command or a script or whatever, that happens inside a scope. And that scope is a hierarchy of scopes. The parent scope, or the outermost scope, is the global scope. That's basically the blue screen or the IC, whatever PowerShell host you are in. That's why we've always said when you create, say, a variable in PowerShell and you close PowerShell, it goes away unless you use a profile script to create all of that next time you start PowerShell. That's because when the scope goes away, everything in it goes away. But scope gets a little more interesting because from the global scope, if I run a script, the PS1 file, that creates another scope. And think of it as like these nested dolls or the boxes. So everything that's happening in that script, whatever it's doing or creating or referencing, is all happening in another scope, another little layer. That gets better because your script may have functions. And you're calling that function. Now I have yet another scope. If you've been really crazy, you may have a nested function inside your function. That's yet another scope. And there's no limit to this. So you have this huge hierarchy of scope. And you're doing all these things. You're referencing variables. You're creating PS drives. You're doing all sorts of things. And you may not get the behavior you are expecting because there are some rules about scope that a lot of people don't pay attention to. First rule. So let's say you're doing some piece of code in one of these scopes, and you're referencing a variable like $foo. PowerShell will first look in the current scope for $foo. And if it finds it, it uses that variable. If it doesn't find it, then it searches up to the parent scope, and so on until it finds what it is that you're referencing. In some ways, that's not too bad because if you're running a function and you're referencing the WSMan PS drive, which was defined in the global scope, you don't have to define it in your script. It'll go up and find it and use that drive. So in some ways, that's okay. But really where people get more burned is when they're referencing things like variables or other things that are unique to what they're trying to use in their code. if it searches up and doesn't find what it's looking for, you may or may not get an error. It depends on what you're doing with the thing you're looking for. But it searches first in the current scope. So one thing that can get you, if you're in that current scope and you've defined something, but you actually thought, oh, I'm going to reference the one that's up in the global scope, yeah, you're not going to get that because it's going to find the one that matches where you currently are. This is the one that really gets you, though, the most. Let's say you need to create a new variable, $foo. So your function creates $foo. PowerShell, by default, will only write or create things in the current scope. So you create $foo in your function. The function ends, the script ends, you're back at your global scope, you look for $foo, it's gone. Because when the scope goes away, everything in it goes away. Now, yes, there are techniques that you can tell PowerShell, create this variable in this particular scope. There's like the $global prefix. New variable has a parameter for -scope. But those should be exceptions, and that's you telling PowerShell, hey, I know I'm doing something that's really out of the norm, but I got this, okay? I'm going to new variable, foo, -scope, global. Now there's no misunderstanding about where that thing's going to be created. But what happens for a lot of people is that they create stuff in a script, the script ends, it goes away, and they're still expecting it to be there. Where this really ticks you off is if you're using the PowerShell IAC, and I haven't fully tested this in VS Code because I test my scripts in other ways, but in the PowerShell IAC, everything is in the global scope. So when you run a function in the PowerShell IAC and it defines a variable, it sticks around in the global scope. Now, in some ways, that's useful as a script developer because I can run my code and then I have all those things and I can just do it on the console and check things. And however, if you have had the IAC open and you run one code and it creates some variables and whatnot, and then you test another script that maybe references some variables that maybe you're reusing the name, but you weren't careful to create the variable in the second script, it'll find that variable from the previous script. And then all of a sudden, you think it works when it really doesn't, or it works but not the result you're expecting. So in the ISE, the thing to do is create all of that, but you're going to test outside of PowerShell, outside of the ISE in a new PowerShell console window. And all of this is in the About Scopes help topic. How many of you have read the About Scopes help topic? All right. He is your role model right there. You have to do that. The rule is that you should avoid referencing out-of-scope items in your code. Meaning, don't use a variable unless you've defined it in your function. The exception being built-in PS drives that you already have, like your C drive, and that's fine. For the most part, usually it's things like variables that can really hurt you. So let me let's do a little demo. So I'm going to run Okay, so in this script, scope.ps1, I'm going to create a variable $x, set it to 100. I'm going to create a new PS drive called work, and I'm going to create a file that takes x times x and saves it to a file in my drive, and then display the contents of that file. So you can see I get the new drive, and then there's the result. However, if I look now here in the global scope, I don't have $X. There's no PS drive called work. Because as soon as that scope went away, all those things go away. So you have to be careful about what it is that you are doing. So here's an example of where you can get into trouble. So let's say that I am lazy or negligent and forget to specify a value for X. But over here, so now my global scope has a value for X. So I still created the drive, but now I see the value is 4. And that works. So obviously, when you're writing stuff to the file system, or if you're creating a new mailbox or a SharePoint site or something that's outside of PowerShell, those things obviously will persist. But, so what happened here with $X is, I'm referencing $X here on line 6. PowerShell looks in the current scope and says, hey, I can't find this. So instead, it searches up the scope, finds the global scope, and uses that value, which may or may not be what you are expecting. I get burned because I'm in PowerShell all the time, and my PowerShell session is open for days at a time. And often I'm writing and working stuff, and I tend to reuse variables just for the sake of simplicity. But then I'll be running something, go, wait a minute, how's that working? Or why is that not working? Oh, it's because I used a variable that I used in another script I was working on 2 days ago. If I run this in the PowerShell IC, now I still have $X, and I have the PS drive. Because in the IC, everything is scoped together. Now, one nice thing about using VS Code, which is what you should all be moving to for your editor, is that VS Code, if you create, in fact, here, I can bring it up real quickly here. As soon as PowerShell finishes starting, so it can parse the script here. At least if I can make this bigger. So the the PowerShell, there we go. So now I get, go away. I got a squiggle underneath here. And VS Code has a built-in script analyzer and it says the variable X is assigned but never used. So this is a great indication. Well, usually, this is not a foolproof rule. So as soon as I do $X times, or $X plus $Z, so now that rule that can go away. The other way that you can avoid scoping problems is to use set strict mode. The number one reason for using set strict mode is when you run the script, if you reference a variable that has not been defined in that scope, it will complain. This saves you from typos where you may have up here $computer, and then later, 500 lines later, you write PowerShell doesn't know that that variable is the same, that you meant it to be the same as the other one. It thinks it's a completely new variable. But at strict mode, when you turn that on, PowerShell will say, hey, you are referencing a variable you haven't defined in your current scope. So that will save you from a lot of headaches. Now, I tend not to use set strict mode anymore, but it's good, I don't want to say training wheels, but it's a good way for beginners to kind of get yourself in some good habits. So that can be helpful there. That will avoid problems. So let's look at, I have another. So here's some one's a little more advanced here. So I'm going to have a script file, PS1 file. I also have some functions. The functions themselves are kind of irrelevant about what they're going to do, but let's just actually run this in. I'll leave VS Code in case we need to go back to that. So the alpha function that I'm going to use is basically going to create a variable. So I'm creating the variable $alpha, give it a value of 123. I'm also creating a global scope variable called alpha global and giving it a value of 1. That's what that $global prefix thing is doing. That's me telling PowerShell I'm doing something out of the norm. I'm explicitly creating a variable I know will be in the global scope, not where I am now. I'm okay with that. And then I can, reference those variables. Bravo is creating a local variable, 456, and it's also using the $script prefix, which in essence is the same thing as saying set it in this local scope. But it's an explicit way of doing that. And I'm going to display some messages trying to reference these different variables. So, all right, so the main variable exists because that was in the main part of the function. So here is the main part. Here's main, $main, I was here. So, and then I call the alpha function. The alpha's output is the $alpha, which is the local to the function, and then the global variable. And then the Bravo function, I see this is set to, I can't really go back and forth because it's going to the next part of my script. And then the Bravo output is showing the Bravo functions scripts. Now, when you try to reference the out-of-scope variables, so alpha is 123 and Bravo is 456. It doesn't quite work because the Bravo function is gone, and so that script variable that I set doesn't exist. And the alpha function is only in the, other way around. The alpha function was missing its value. Yeah. Now, you can save the output from the functions to variables, and then everything works as expected. Or you can use the variables that are visible in the current scope, in this case, my demo script, and then everything works as expected. What's left here in the global scope? Some of these will give me an errors, but so it found alpha global, and that's it. Because all the other variables were just set in their particular scopes. So you need to be careful. Now, if I run this in the PowerShell IC, I'll get completely different results because all the variables will be persistent. So your best practice is when you're creating a PowerShell script or function, go ahead and create it and define it and work with it all in the PowerShell IC or VS Code. But when you're done, open up a clean PowerShell window, console window, and run your code. Run it with no profile. I think I have this in some slides here. Let me go back to the slides. That's actually coming up to the profile thing. So run it, run your script, new PowerShell session with no profile. Because you don't want to have taken a chance, this is not necessarily scope related, but a function or scripting thing, which I think we're going to get to a little bit later, but I'm going to talk about it now, where you've written a piece of code, but it's using something from your profile script that you just assume, because you've used it for so long, that everyone has that thing. But they don't. Anyone been burned by this? Yeah. So you have to test your code outside of your editor and outside of your normal. If even better, fire up a Windows container or a VM and run your script there. Because you need to test and verify, will this work? Am I missing dependencies? Don't assume that just because your code works in the ISE that you're done. Any other questions on scope?
Does the VS Code act like ISE?
In terms of scoping, I'm not sure. I've not tested this script in VS Code. I tend to write my code in VS Code and then run it in a separate PowerShell session because the PowerShell integrated terminal is still a little wonky in VS Code. So it's fine to do like a single line. If I just like highlight a command and want to run it, that's okay. But trying to do anything else I have found is still kind of tedious.
Does scope persist between open console windows?
Does this
the global scope?
No, the global scope goes away, and if I open up two different PowerShell windows, they're completely different.
Okay.
So you can't create one variable in another. Now, the only thing that, and it's not necessarily variables, but one thing that does kind of persist is history. But that really has nothing to do with scope. That has to do with the fact that if you're using PS readline, your history can be persisted to a text file, and that can persist across PowerShell sessions, which is actually kind of cool because it will also work between, say, PowerShell Core on Windows and Windows PowerShell. So I run them both side by side, and I can run a command in Windows PowerShell, then go over to my PowerShell Core, do Control-R to search PS readline history, and I can find the command that I ran in my Windows PowerShell. That's kind of cool, but that's kind of separate from the scoping thing. That would be the only sort of thing that would relate to persistence. And that's the whole reason we have PowerShell profile scripts, is so that if I want to have this variable, you define it so that when PowerShell starts, I have that. Anything else? Oh, there's a question. I'm glad you can see that because I'm just blinded up here.
Hello? Okay. So with the scope going away when the PowerShell script ends,
Yeah.
Does that also mean why I can't get stuff if I call so if I'm calling a PowerShell script from another PowerShell script, it doesn't pass it back up?
Yeah, it may not pass it back up unless you are .sourcing it. And that's why we use modules. So here's another, let's go back and let's see if this answers your question. This is another thing that trips people up. So in this scope 2, I've got two functions, right? I've got alpha and bravo. If I come back to the console here, now I already ran the script. Now what some people will think is that I should have a function called alpha or Bravo, and I don't, because those functions were defined in the script scope, and when the script ends, that scope goes away, those functions go away. If I want those functions to persist, this is where you need to do what's called dot sourcing. And this trips people up because often we're in the same directory. So the first type, a period. Think of it as an anchor. And then a space. Sometimes it's hard to see. The second period is just part of the relative path to the PS1 file. Okay? Because remember, when you're running a PS1 file, you have to tell PowerShell the full path to the file. So that dot tells PowerShell, go ahead and run the script. Let me just run this through all this. When the script finishes, anything that you created in that scope, leave here where I put the anchor, where I put the dot. So now, I have those functions because they were left behind because of the dot sourcing. So what you can do is, and I think I understand what you're trying to say here, is if you are creating a new script, and maybe you're trying to call a script that has some other functions, so when I run this script file, it will dot source the other script file that has the function I want to use, and then I can call them in this script file. So that way then when the script ends, everything goes away, but I've gotten everything what I needed. If you need to do stuff like this, the better approach would be to take this script that you're dot sourcing and turn it into a module. And put it in one of the module directories. That way PowerShell will just auto-load the command. Before we had modules, way back in the day, this is what we had to do. So this is kind of like an old style includes statement.
Will that work in a non-interactive, like if I'm using task scheduler to run these?
Sure, yeah, absolutely, yeah. Because what's going to happen, same type of thing. So let's pretend, that this getFoo.ps1 has the getFoo function. If I just do that, this outer script is going to run. It's going to then run that inner script, getFoo.ps1, which defines a function that goes away. If I try to call that function, say getFoo, back in the main script says, hey, I don't know what that is. But if I dot source it, it'll run the script, keep the function in the script scope. I can then reference it, and then when the script scope goes away, everything goes away. But again, modules would be a better approach because then you don't have to worry about dot sourcing anything. You just run your command and it finds it. That's a good question. Anything else? I've opened up a can of worms. I told you this is the number one topic that can be tricky because a lot of people come into PowerShell, they don't come from any sort of scripting background, and so this idea of scope is completely foreign. So it's okay to have questions and be a little, what's going on here?
Yeah, I've never written a module. I've used functions a little bit, but I thought you said modules had to be compiled in an earlier class?
No. Modules do not have to be compiled. There are some modules that are binary modules, but no. Modules are just a collection of script files structured in a certain way with certain types of files going in a particular directory. But they don't have to be compiled.
All right. Okay, thank you.
You can create a module simply by taking a PS1 file, rename it to PSM1, and that's a module. Now, whether it gets auto-loaded, that's a different story, but creating a module is just a text file. It's just another type of PowerShell script. All right, let's go back here. Let's move along because time will get by me before I know it. So, kind of related to all of this is what I was talking about with profile scripts. Don't assume that just because your code runs in your editor that you're done. You need to make sure that you aren't relying on something in your profile script. Especially VS Code's console is still a little buggy. The integrated PowerShell thing, they've got some buffering and just the way they're writing stuff. Oh, and I'll also tell you that if you're using VS Code, which I feel bad about saying because I want you to use VS Code, but I want you to also understand there's still limitations to it. If you're working in VS Code and you're trying to, and you don't seem to be getting the results you're expecting, or something just doesn't seem right, exit VS Code, open it up again. I think that there is some other memory thing going on sometimes with some PowerShell stuff, and I've run into this situation where it's not, the code doesn't run in VS Code, or I don't get the results I'm expecting, but if I exit and go back in, then it all works again. So, just weird, I don't know. Test from the PowerShell console. Test from a clean console with no profiles. You can just open up PowerShell and type PowerShell, no profile. So right now, this session has my profile. There we go. So now it's a brand new PowerShell session with no profile. Very clean. So now I could test my code right from there. And certainly if you're doing anything cross-platform, you want to test it in an appropriate cross-platform session. Or even better, if you happen to be using the new Windows terminal, then you can open up, I've got some Windows, I built for example, I built one with loads PowerShell, Windows PowerShell with no profile, so you can create little terminal and then run your code repeatedly in each of those terminals and make sure that it all works the way you want it to. I can't wait for the terminal to finally, really get going and work out the last final kinks. That will be very useful. And as I said, even better, test your scripts in something like a VM that's completely distinct from your environment. Or have a buddy test it or something. All right, let's talk about strings and paths. And some of these are my pet peeves. It's not that they're technically wrong, except I think they are. Avoid concatenation. How many of you used to write VB script? All right, the old people, like me. Yeah, in the old days, we had to use the plus symbol to kind of concatenate strings together. We don't want to really do that in PowerShell. So instead of having code like this, where you define a variable $file, bar.dat, and then we create a path for it. I've seen people do this. So they'll create $p will be basically the parent path plus $file. The plus symbol is for addition. And yes, I know technically we're adding two strings, but no, you're adding numbers. You don't add strings. Because when I see this in someone's code, that tells me they're still thinking text. They're thinking the old school way. They're not thinking the PowerShell way. Plus is for adding numbers. Instead, I want proof that you, as a scripter, have understood PowerShell and know about variable expansion and sub-expressions. So here's one way that you could do it for a very simple path. Just define the path. Because you know that in double quotes, if you have a simple variable like $file, or it's just a string, PowerShell will expand that variable and replace the contents. I don't need to concatenate. So the first example, I can tell you're a absolute rookie beginner, or you just don't care. That's kind of harsh, sorry. That went dark quickly.
trying to get things done quickly.
Yes. Well, actually, that takes longer to type as far as I'm concerned, because then you got to get all your quoting and stuff right. But the second example is the better, pure PowerShell way. That tells me, okay, you understand PowerShell. You're starting to understand objects and all of that. We'll get to the other path stuff here in a moment. This is just one approach that would be better than concatenating. So here's some other things that trip people up, kind of related to building strings. Let's say you get the bit service. So $B will be a service object. And you want to write some message, say to a log file or a message to the user. And I see this all the time. They'll do $B plus is running. Assuming that, the $B.name will be replaced, and they got the concatenation, they got to add in the spacing and the quoting. Again, that is someone still thinking text. The better approach is to use sub-expressions. So again, I'm using double quotes so that PowerShell will expand the sub-expression. Now, I can't just do $B.name or $B.status, because that is actually still going to be an object. I put that in parentheses and then the $sign outside of that, so that PowerShell basically says, okay, I'm going to get the value of the name property of $B, and then treat that internally as kind of like a in-memory variable, referenced kind of by the outer $sign. And then PowerShell will replace that because it's in double quotes. So now it'll say bits is running. And again, this is a better indication that you understand PowerShell's object nature and not just thinking text. Because that is, until people who are new to PowerShell get over that everything is text and start thinking about objects and the way PowerShell looks at things, you're going to struggle until you reach that point. And when I see this, or when you start doing this, then you'll know, oh, I'm getting this. If you're concatenating, you need a little more work to really understand and think the way that PowerShell is thinking. Now, when it comes to paths, actually, the better thing to do would be to use a command like join path, instead of trying to concatenate or trying to use sub-expressions and all of that. So join path, and just for the sake of the slide, I omitted the parameters. So it's join path, parent path, cfoo, and then child path, $file. That then will give me the correct path. This is great because this will work for different providers. If you're trying to build a path, say that's in the registry, or if you're working with something cross-platform. Because when you're Linux, the slashes go the other way. And that way you don't have to remember, but do I have the slashes going the right way? Did I add the right slash? Do I need the trailing slash? Don't worry about that. Let join path figure that all out. Now, sometimes it can be a little tricky. So let's say I want to create a path that's going to be in my temp folder, or the data subfolder of my temp directory, and then the file is going to be test.txt. So the parent path, well, I can either use, in this case, sub-expressions, or the variable expansion to get the temp environmental variable, /data. This is me assuming that I'm on a Windows machine. And then the file is test.txt. Or I could do it this way, and the parent is my temp directory, and then the child path is data.txt. If I really wanted to be careful, I don't have this in the slide, is I would do join path for, say, the data.test.txt, and then a second join path to the parent. So build my path in 2 steps. That way, especially if I'm doing something cross-platform, I don't have to worry that I'm getting the slashes in the right way. I would let join path do that. So let's show you. I just have a few things. So this is, here's an example. No, I need, no, it's not right. There we go. There's no title bar, that's why I just have it. So this is an Ubuntu instance on my machine here. So if I do F, to the color schemes here, I'm still not happy within the editor because you can't see the equal sign I just typed. Now let's use parameter names. And again, you can't see the parent, you can't see the color scheme. So let's just do built-in home file.txt. So now, or let's do it this way. Let's do a better one. So now $F has been created. I didn't have to concatenate anything, but it took the paths and the child path, created it, and it got the slashes all in the right way. For those of you, again, who are going to be scripting cross-platform, that's a great way of preventing any sort of issues. And if I do, let's come here to so I don't have to worry about anything, just let join path do its thing. That is a much better approach for you to take. All right, let's go into coding into a corner, because I've got definitely some more demos on this, a little more interesting. So when you're writing a PowerShell function, functions only do one thing, and they write one type of object to the pipeline. If you have functions that are writing strings and dates and service objects as the result of the output of your command, you're doing it wrong. You're just making, well, yeah, you're doing it wrong. You're making your command unusable in anywhere else in the PowerShell ecosystem. I see this all the time as well, is don't include formatting in your function. If your function ends and inside your function you have pipe to format table, again, you're doing it wrong. Because now that function can never do anything else other than send you a format table output. And if that's what you want, fine. That should be completely exceptional, and it's just don't do that for beginners, especially. Your function needs to write a single object to the pipeline. If it needs to be the results formatted as a table, then you run your function pipe to format table. Because maybe tomorrow you need it to be a list. Or I need to take the output and I need to save it to an XML file. If your function just ends up in formatting results as a table, you can't do anything with that other than look at your pretty output. Same thing with sending it to an out commandlet. There's other things I've seen people do. Don't have your function end, say, going to out grid view. Because maybe you don't want out grid view tomorrow. Or maybe, I've written that function and I was silly and I used out grid view and he tries to run it. So no, I don't want it out grid view. I want to, export to a CSV file. Again, you've coded yourself into a corner. Let PowerShell, if you need to manipulate the output, use PowerShell's tools to do that. Your function should be like a commandlet writes one type of object to the pipeline. So let's look at some of this before we run out of time. Now, there are ways around these things if you want the formatting, for example. So here's an example of a bad version of the function. And let me just load this here. So get system status gives me a string that shows me the name of the operating system, and then processes. where the works, oh, I'm going to change this. Let's make this smaller or greater, let's say 500. And services that are running. And it displays all of this as a table. So let's say, you know what, I want to save that to as a CSV file or as CSV output. Nope, doesn't work. I'm not getting objects. And here's a good example how you can see. If I run my function, pipe it to get member as an elusive GM, I'm getting a string object and a service controller object because I don't have any processes. So my function is writing two things. In the table part, yeah, because the table itself is also a string. So don't do this. This is a bad function. I'm doing several things, and I have formatted output. So here's the better approach. I'm going to create an object, a single type of object. In fact, I'm going to modify this different from the example. Because maybe later I can create some formatting or type extensions for this custom object. Because now I have an object, and I have not coded myself into a corner. If I want, I can say, you know what, let's make this as a list. Or convert to CSV. Assuming I can spell it right. Well, CSV is a bad format because I've got an object here, but convert to JSON. There we go. So I have options because I haven't coded myself in anywhere because I've written. Why the cursor won't jump around here? Because I'm creating a custom object to the pipeline. So single type of object. If you need to do stuff with it, then let PowerShell do its thing. Now, that's not to say that you don't have a need for maybe kind of, for lack of a, well, there are probably better words, but since this is in my head anyway, orchestrating. I know orchestration has kind of a different context for some people. So you can create what's called a control script. A control script is kind of like a canned PowerShell session, or you interacting. These are all the commands that you could type interactively, except you know what? I need to, all these things are run in this particular order. Instead of having me type it, I'll just run a control script. And it's a script, so it can have parameters and whatnot. So let's say I do want to create that nice viewable text report using stuff with format table and whatnot. Here you can see I'm .sourcing. That better functions. So I've got another directory here that's loading the better function. Oh, one I just created, which I should save. Oh, I went to the wrong one. This one. So let's say I did want to see all this output from these commands formatted as a table. That's fine. Put it in a control script. Because this is something that you are just running or someone else is running, just to maybe using commands that you have built, but now you can get it structured the way you want it to. But knowing that this is the only thing this thing can do is what you have defined in your control script. The other one I have here will do the same type of thing. So let's say that I have code, and because I haven't written into anything, I can run control script 2. That creates a HTML file using the function that I .sourced that just writes objects to the pipeline. So I'm not limited to what is in the function. I can reuse it for lots of other things here. And we're almost done here. Some quick resources if you are still kind of new to scripting. The Learn Scripting in a Month of Lunches. This is the follow-up book to the Learn PowerShell in a Month of Lunches. Once you're through that, or feel like, yeah, I think I know most scripting, then this is the more definitive book. This is up on LeanPub. The LeanPub books, what's nice here is that they're all digital. They're basically ebooks. And as we update this, in fact, I'm working on an update now. After you buy it, you get you'll get a little notification saying, hey, there's a new version of the book. You go download the new version of the book. So you're not constantly buying new versions. Once you buy this, it's yours for as long as we update it. And then the other book that some of you may find useful, especially if you're new, is the PowerShell Practice Primer. These are 100 exercises for you to do in PowerShell. These don't require any scripting, but they help you learn how PowerShell works and meant to help you start thinking like PowerShell. The result of the exercise is not that important, but it's how you figured out the result. And it's usually no more than 1 or 2 commands that you type interactively in the console. All right, so we have a few minutes left for other questions. I know I kind of flew through some of that, but what other things are tripping you up or you're wondering about? And there's a microphone flying around. There should be a drone. That would be the better way to do it. Wouldn't that be awesome? Yeah, there should be the drone with just the mic hanging down.
The concatenation and the join path stuff.
Wait, I'm going to have to walk over with these. No, go ahead.
Is it dependent on PowerShell version?
I didn't hear the first part.
The concatenation and the join path stuff. Is that on PowerShell? Does that depend on PowerShell version?
No, join path has been in PowerShell for as long as I can remember.
Okay, because I have a startup script that I run to bring up new Windows 10 machines, and I have to do the old school concatenation for pathing for some of the stuff.
I don't know. Maybe it wasn't. It should have been around, as far as I know. Version 3 came in? Oh, yeah. So if you still have, for some reason, running PowerShell 2, maybe it doesn't work.
Well, the Windows 10 machines.
Well, then this should work. Now, join path doesn't verify the path or anything. It just creates a string with the proper slashes and stuff. If you want to show me something later, I'm happy to look and see if there's something else that's going on, but what else? Did I answer any of your questions? Were some of you, if you have other things that you were worried about and don't want to embarrass yourself, you can embarrass yourself in front of me out in the hallway. Oh, and I have a session this afternoon. I think it's remoting. I have no idea. I just said show up and talk so I can talk. Yeah, module scoping has kind of its own sort of rules, but you don't have to .source anything. Yeah, I could do a whole session maybe next year on modules. So if you have a specific question, find me and we can answer it. All right, thanks all. Have a good time the rest of the day.